believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? First episode of the new year, 2024, and I'm super excited to get back at it and give you guys tons of amazing guests, amazing conversations, and today is a great one. Today we have the author of a great book called The Sleeper Agent: The Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator Antigens of Biological Warfare. And this isn't the first time I've hit this topic. I've also had in the past, it was quite a while ago, Chris Newby, who's a scientist who wrote the book Bitten: The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Bioweapons. And Chris Newby was actually on twice, one time before COVID. It was episode 202, and then after COVID on episode 290. And the reason why I had her on after COVID is because there was a lot of conversation and speculation that COVID was a bioweapon. So it only made sense to have her return, somebody who went deep into the history of bioweapons and specifically also Lyme disease, to get her take on what was going on in the world. So it's a great conversation. You can find those episodes and all my episodes on my website. Just go in the search engine and look up any guests that you might want to go back in the archives and check out. And even though that was a great conversation with Chris Newby, and we went deep into the history of bioweapons and also specifically Lyme disease, today's guest, Adam W. Finnegan, goes even deeper, and we get into a lot of new information. And Adam went over and beyond to really get as much information as possible in regards to the history of bioweapons, because similar to Chris Newby, he was personally affected by Lyme disease, and that's what sparked his interest in trying to really figure out the origin story of Lyme disease, which of course puts you down the rabbit hole of bioweapons and that whole history. So before we get into this very fascinating conversation, let me remind you that this is a value for value show. If you get any value out of these discussions, if you appreciate the work that I bring to you, if you appreciate the time and effort I put into trying to bring you the most interesting guests and podcast episodes, please consider giving some value back. As I typically remind you guys, it doesn't have to be financial. You can rate the show, review the show. Something that I haven't mentioned in a long time also is you can post the show anywhere. This is a open source show, so feel free to post any episode you enjoy, any clip you enjoy, anywhere you want, on any of the platforms you're on. The most important thing is getting the information out there and getting these episodes out there. It's not about me personally getting the clicks or downloads or whatnot. So don't worry about that. Post it freely as you would like. And wherever you listen to the Ripple Effect podcast or watch the Ripple Effect podcast, please leave a comment, a review, a thumbs up, a like. Any and all interactions is very much appreciated and will help fight against the algorithms that suppress shows like these. But if you are in a good financial situation and if you can financially support the show, please consider doing so. It doesn't matter how little of a donation or how little you can afford to help. Every penny matters. Every dollar goes a long way. And if a small percentage of people who listen and download and watch the Ripple Effect podcast donated as little as $1 a month, I could easily do this show full time. So that just puts in perspective how little you have to invest and help the Ripple Effect podcast to really help us achieve our goal of eventually doing the show full time. And there's plenty of ways of supporting the show if you can do so. We have a PayPal account if you want to send a one-time donation, a Venmo account. We have a crypto wallet. We also have a Patreon page if you want to support us monthly. We have a merch store with hats, stickers, t-shirts, hoodies, tons of great stuff. You see me repping t-shirts and hoodies and mugs on the Union episodes and also on the Ripple Effect podcast episodes. So I know firsthand that it's all high quality stuff. It lasts a long time, and it's a great way of getting some cool merch and also supporting a show that you enjoy. And then another great way of helping the Ripple Effect podcast is checking out our sponsors, one of them being Content Safe. Content Safe runs my website, takes care of most of my IT issues, and also syncs all my video channels together. So I only have to upload my videos to one location, and then magically that video description thumbnail appears on all my video channels. So if that's something that you think could be useful to you, please contact Content Safe. Let them know you're listening to Ripple Effect Podcast, and they'll definitely hook you up. Another great sponsor is the University of Reason, created by Richard Grove. And these very popular autonomy courses has helped a lot of people. And I know a lot of people listening are probably sick of the job that they're working. They're sick of being a mouse on a wheel, just running in place. And if you're one of those people, if you're at a crossroads in life and you want to try something different or connect with a liberty-minded community, hit up Richard Grove. Please, of course, always use the link on my website or in the show description, and you can help yourself and help the Ripple Effect podcast at the same time. And then also my last sponsor is Element Electrolytes, probably the only sponsor I use on a daily basis. If you do keto, if you like to fast, if you are just looking for a way of staying hydrated, which helps with so many issues like headaches, muscle fatigue, soreness, and many other symptoms due to dehydration, and you're looking for a way of staying hydrated, a product that tastes good, has no artificial colors, no artificial sweeteners, has enough of the ingredients you need to really get the most out of your body and optimize your body and mind, please check out Element Electrolytes. It's a great product. Of course, always use the link on the website or in the show description, and you'll get a free gift with every purchase just for my audience. And this product was formulated by Rob Wolf, another great past guest of the Ripple Effect podcast. He's also been on many other huge shows like Joe Rogan and many others. So if you want to learn a little bit more about him, just look up Rob Wolf. He is an OG in the health and nutrition community. And when using the link for Element Electrolytes, you can also find tons of science and information on why it's so important to stay hydrated, why electrolytes are so important, and also all the science that backs those claims. So thank you so much, people, for listening. Remember, I also have a Telegram group chat if you want to join there. Check out my other show. I co-host with Charlie Robinson, Sam Tripley, and Mike from the OBDM show called The Union of the Unwanted. It's a roundtable panel show. If you like the music you're about to hear and also the music at the beginning and end of the podcast, check it out. It's called Theory 6. You can find links in the show description, just like you can find links to everything I refer to in this intro. Enjoy this amazing conversation, and I'll talk to you on the next one. Peace.
Well, kind of a misfit, but growing up, this is all something that kind of came about sporadically. I got Lyme disease. My mother had it many years ago. I think she found out about it in the early 2000s, and I had read that book, Lab 257. As you know, most people are aware of the whole Plum Island connection because of that book. And of course, Eric Traub, the guy, the Nazi scientist who was on Plum Island working there. And also this book goes very deep into his life because there's been kind of a mystery around him for so many years because of that. But also the one who originally brought out that Lyme disease biological warfare connection was John Loftus in 1982 in a book called The Belarus Secret, which is now called America's Nazi Secret. And he was a former military intelligence officer. He was also a Nazi hunter from the Justice Department. His job was to hunt down Nazi war criminals hiding in America after the war. And so he did a lot of work in that area, especially it overlaps Operation Paperclip. And his sources were telling him that, yeah, bioweapons were unleashed on Americans. Lyme disease is part of that. So he brought that out. in 1982, and he said it was being spread by ticks the year before it was even acknowledged. So the following year, the scientists said, yeah, it's being spread by ticks, but they denied that those experiments ever took place. So he wrote the introduction to this book, which I'm really happy to have. And so I was always interested in the topic of biological warfare. I'm kind of an intense person, so I like intense subjects and, heavy metal music and stuff like that. And I was always interested in reading this topic. So when I got sick, I had read Lab 257, and this guy Traub always stayed with me. I'm like, oh, that guy Traub, there's something more to him. And I got chronically ill in 2016. I got bit by a tick that year. I didn't notice a bullseye rash, but then again, I pulled it off my back, and I didn't even look. And I started getting these crazy headaches, joint pain, fatigue, the whole 9 yards. And I think I had been sick my whole life anyway, with a lot of that like chronic fatigue types of stuff. And so I was like, I had made up my mind at one point. I was like, all right, I'm going to start looking into this Lyme disease thing, because this is a really interesting topic. And since I ended up finding out I had Lyme disease, but I had to go to a special doctor and get that special test that's, expensive and all that. And I was kind of like, why, because when I first started going in, it was really hard to get any kind of like help for my disease. And they were just like, yeah, we don't see anything wrong with your scans. There's nothing wrong with your blood work, this and that. So it was all normal. And I was like, this is insane. How could I have these insane headaches, but yet they're telling me we don't see anything wrong? So that was kind of like, that's when I started looking into Lyme disease in more depth. And that's when, so I had put this timeline together a long time ago. And it was actually, it was all over the internet because people were reposting it. It was called the Lyme disease and Mycoplasma bioweapons timeline. And it was a really long timeline. And I had found John Loftus online, and I sent it to him. Didn't hear back from him for a long time. And then finally got back to me. He's like, oh, hey, why don't you give me a call? And so I talked to him, and I had already kind of decided that I was going to write this book. Now, this was 2017 or 2016, 2017-ish. I had become friendly with a lot of Lyme disease activists. And so it all kind of came together. And John Loftus introduced me to some film people that were doing a film project about it. Nothing was ever produced yet, but they were working on it. And one of the ladies who I became very good friends with provided me a lot of help and like financial support to get all of these German documents from the German universities that most, like Eric Traub's, like I have his entire life work, like all of his published research, a lot of his colleagues on the bioweapons facility in Germany called Insel Reims. And, I got like an embezzlement investigation on him, all sorts of stuff. So that was really nice. And it was just a painstaking thing, translating all of those papers into English, from German to English, and then, having to analyze them and learn this very complex science. And what his science had shown was the mechanisms of chronic disease and the whole thing about these things being able to evade tests, that you have not very much inflammation, you don't have antibodies, but yet you have this infection that is, like the systemic infection. So his work really brought that out. And that's kind of like, even though I say the rise of Lyme disease, it's about so much more than just Lyme disease, because it really goes over the whole, it covers like the chronic fatigue syndrome. It covers all of those mystery diseases that are really controversial in the public health system, most people will just get sent out the door and told there's nothing wrong with you. So it was a long journey. And then, I kind of corresponded with Loftus throughout the whole thing. He would give me some hints on what to look into without telling me classified information, but being able to kind of give me some pointers on where to research. And it was just, it took me 6 years of immense work. And this is kind of the result. It was over 1,000 pages originally, right? But after a while, I was like, all right, that's way too much. It was way too technical. So I ended up rewriting it. And it's like 316 pages or so. So I guess that's kind of how it all came about. And
what happened with your own personal Lyme disease case? So did you get better? Did you, doing all this research, did you find methods or treatments that helped? And what were your long-term symptoms? And do you still have any?
yeah, I still have like the headaches permanently. They never go away. Like they're always with me, but they're not as bad as they used to be. The fatigue has more or less kind of subsided. Like I like riding BMX, so I ride every day. And I haven't back when I was treating like with various things for several years, but I always found that when I was treating constantly, I just felt horrible. And so, and I didn't see much improvement. So I just kind of like, I guess you could say just kind of like I cope with it, but I make like lifestyle changes, like getting outside every day and riding my bike is like a big deal. It does help me feel a lot better, but also, dietary changes. I mean, I'm kind of like a really spiritual person too, so it's a whole combination of things, I guess you could say. But I am a lot less sick than I used to be. But the thing is that usually when you get sick first, you get really sick. What we've noticed, even with people that didn't even try to treat at all, is that a lot of times they'll be really sick for a really long time or for, many years, and they'll kind of like slowly taper off. It's not always the rule, but most of the time, I mean, generally. Some girls, though, tend to get really, really sick. I don't know what it is, but it seems to affect girls harder than it does guys, even though I would say we still get pretty sick. A lot of the girls get really like debilitated, like bedridden. So, having all of those friends and stuff, like all of those girls that were sick, it was motivation for me when I saw how sick they were and how, nobody was helping them, how helpless they felt. It really like inspired me to just really go at this thing. And so it goes over like early biological warfare. And it also goes through like how this game is fought, like with the intelligence channels, how it's always hidden under the covers of like benign research, how it's usually waged through secret access sabotage. Like Eric Traub, for example, we put him on the biodefense. He was like as high up as you can get in biodefense. And what he was a supervisory bacteriologist at the time on our program. And he was doing these insect tests with like ticks released on shorebirds that were supposed to be carrying these harmless tracer bacteria. But of course, it wasn't so harmless. And I show with very reliable evidence. I show like when he acquired the spirochetes, I show that same year he acquired them. He was also well versed in like combinations of infections, because usually people don't just get Lyme disease. They get stuff like babesiosis, they get ehrlichiosis, they get various rickettsia, which is like it's like ehrlichiosis and what is the other one? So babesiosis, and Bartonella is another one. So they get these mix of infections that are really complicated. And he was versed in that the same year that he acquired the spirochetes. I can link the spirochete that he got. It was a strain from birds, and I was able to link Borrelia burgdorferi to this strain. And I really get into like the nitty gritty details of this whole thing. I show how in 1946, for example, the black-legged tick was not a known carrier of any disease at the time in the United States. They started to get it to transmit, anaplasmosis. They said, it transmits anaplasmosis like experimentally. So they were experimenting with it. I also show that the USDA was collecting it annually. And at the time when they were doing those tracer experiments, when Traub got here, they were like, all right, this is a good tick to use because it's got no diseases. So they started using that. And then literally in the mid 50s, all of a sudden, this tick starts to become a serious transmitter of disease. I don't know if you remember, well, I don't know if you know about, but there was a book written by an early Lyme pioneer her name was Polly Murray, and it was called The Widening Circle. Well, she lists the beginning of her illness around 1955, August of 1955. And she talks about how like by the 1960s, she was debilitated. And it wasn't until 1975 that they actually started to put attention on this thing, even though 1975 is not the actual start of Lyme disease. It's just when they acknowledged it publicly. It was spreading since the early 50s. I also have this USDA conference where they were talking about biological warfare attacks on the poultry and cattle industry. And this was 1953, and this is the only conference that mentions, it's the only conference that mentions Borrelia anserina, which was that avian spirochete that is linked to Lyme disease. They said, the theme of the conference was biological warfare, and they said that they thought that several of these foreign animal diseases, hinting that it was like a biological warfare attack, had entered into America and was spreading in the poultry population. And so there was that conference, and that was an important one. And they're basically saying exactly what was going on. So they use like a very subtle tone of saying it all because it's going to be public record. So they don't say, yeah, we've been hit with a bunch of bioterror attacks. They just you can kind of pick up on it. You say, all right, they're obviously kind of worried about something here. So that was another important thing. And I just really go through it. Like every step of the way, there's so much evidence that when it all comes together, it's very reliable. And then I have John Loftus. So he knew somebody who interrogated Eric Traub. And Eric Traub kind of confessed about being a Soviet double agent. So another thing you want to keep in mind is that Lyme disease started in Germany. That's where it began. So there were these other strains that are considered Lyme disease. Those were spreading in Germany. So I have them with the spirochetes in 1939, and then what he starts doing, he goes to this bioweapons facility where he's vice president. It's called Insel Reams. And now he starts messing with all these animal diseases, but what he's doing is he's adapting them to humans. He's taking animal diseases and he's turning them into human pathogens, basically. And this guy, Eric Traub, was extremely intelligent. He was not a very moral person, but he was extremely intelligent when it came to all of this stuff. And he was considered the best of the best. Like, he was considered, when they brought him over here, it says in his file, there's nobody available who can replace this guy. So he was like one of those VIP bioweaponeers. And one of the things that I noticed too was that when Willie Bergdorfer was brought into the picture, so these poultry conferences had already happened. Eric Traub had already been sent back to Germany quietly for what happened. And then it seemed like Willie Bergdorfer was brought on. He signed on to biodefense, I think in 1954. And they told him for the first year, I think he was in Montana, and they told him, oh yeah, relapsing fever research, or that's what Lyme disease is considered, relapsing fever. They said, oh yeah, that's on its way out. We're not doing that anymore. So what it looks like is that they were compartmentalizing that because of this big blunder that happened. And it looks like what he was responsible for at that time was coming up with ways to rapidly diagnose these pathogens that were filtering through the population. And I have a letter between him and a guy named Billy Bennett where it shows that he accidentally infected himself in the laboratory. And I think it's because Eric Traub's bioweapons were a lot more infectious than he realized, even though he's a spirochete expert. Because one thing that Eric Traub was doing over here, he was taking, like, tick-borne diseases that are normally spread by ticks, and he was making them airborne, that they could be sprayed in a mist. So I think he probably may have even done that with the Lyme spirochete. And Willie accidentally infected himself, and then basically later in life, the Lyme disease had progressed to such a point where he was dying from Alzheimer's, and that's like a really late manifestation of Lyme disease. They even say it in like the early conferences on Lyme disease, like in the 90s. They're like, yeah, the late stage, you get like dementia, you get Alzheimer's and things like that. And that's what Willie died of. And the guy was telling him in the letter, oh, the key to keeping this thing at bay is using certain antibiotics each time you relapse, indicating that it was incurable. Now, when you can get it early on, you may luck out, but when it's left to kind of fester for a while, like you were saying, then you start to have problems. Like my mom, she treated with antibiotics for several years. It seemed like she was getting better, but then in the last like 5 years, it's back, and she's got like a nasty relapse, and she's still got the babesiosis, all the stuff she had before. So this book just basically lays it out like step by step. And like later on, I cover some of the simulant program, which was like, so the biological simulant program was, I'm sure you might have heard of it, but they basically take a bacteria that is supposed to be harmless and they spray it all over the place to simulate like a more dangerous pathogen. So Traub was overseeing that too, where they're doing these airborne tests. And I have him like over in Germany weaponizing the bacteria that they later used. And they did find later on that all of these simulants, all of these simulant bacteria that they thought were harmless weren't so harmless. So I go into that some. Then I start talking about the whole when they started to shine light on Lyme disease, and then they started having all these annual conferences, and of course I cover a little bit about Lymerix, the Lyme disease vaccine that was a complete disaster.
Yeah,
And
I ran into, I remember some years ago, I was doing some research and I forget on what. It might have even been doing some research prior to having Chris Newby on, the scientist who wrote the book Bitten, about her experience with Lyme disease and going into the history of bioweapons. But I ran into a Joe Rogan interview with I forget which MMA fighter, where he was talking about they're both sharing stories of people who got the Lyme disease vaccine and how they got Lyme disease from the vaccine.
yep.
And how sick they got from it, and then they pulled it. And then he had what the hell's his name, the vaccine doctor on Rogan had
I remember that actually.
yeah, so he had the vaccine doctor on, what's his name, the guy with the guy that he wanted to debate, right, that they were trying to get debate
Yeah.
after the Robert Kennedy Jr. interview on Twitter. They're going back and forth. I forget what
Yeah.
that name is, but I run into the clip right afterwards of him talking to that doctor, and that doctor's saying that Lyme disease vaccine got pulled because of the public losing faith in the vaccine, because all these rumors going around that it was unsafe. And this was, so I watched the clip of Rogan sharing his personal story of someone he knew getting Lyme disease and getting really sick from the vaccine, and this MMA fighter also sharing his story. Then, many shows later, I've run into a clip of this conversation he's having with this vaccine doctor, and I know that, of this story, this personal story of Rogan, because he shared it on a previous show. So I'm wondering how he's going to interact with, during this discussion with this vaccine doctor. I'm like, okay, is he just going to let him spew this, or is he going to interject, knowing that he had a personal story and he knows personally that it was doing harm? And like I assumed, he actually did say something. He's like, oh, he's like, is that why it got taken off the market? Because he's like, I know someone who got really sick from it, and got Lyme disease from it and got really messed up, and I believe that's why it got taken off the market. And he's like, no, that's not why. It's because of all these rumors that it was unsafe or whatever. And then Rogan goes, well, how about the MMR vaccine? There's a lot of discussions about the MMR vaccine leading to autism. I don't see the MMR vaccine being pulled. So it was almost like, and it's funny because he had that doctor on who's pro-vaccine, and yet I think the rest of the discussion, like, it didn't change much. Like, he let him spew his pro-vaccine science. But I was wondering, I'm like, I wonder if that little interaction was one of the many interactions that planted this seed of doubt in Rogan in vaccine science, and how these guys are just salesmen for big pharma and whatnot. So it's just like one of the again, so many people repeat this, oh, vaccines are safe and effective, but you look at the history of vaccines, there's many of them, like the Lyme disease vaccine, like the anthrax vaccine, and many others that have done a lot of harm, and it's not even debated.
I can actually speak to that vaccine itself. My mother had it, okay, and she remembers a lot of the people that she worked with also got it. So she worked at a hospital treating people with cancer in Framingham, and she had it's always after the second shot too. She said, oh yeah, a bunch of people after the second shot there was a lot of people that she knew that were permanently debilitated after that. Like they didn't come back to work. They were injured by it. Now, she also was injured by it, although she didn't really know it at the time. So she had like a rash, and she's saying that she was getting so forgetful that she had to write things down, like and post them all over her desk and everything just to remember things. And that's the neurological aspect of it. Now, this antigen that they used, OSPE, this is the whole idea behind my book, where I call it The Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator Antigens of Biological Warfare, because it's these antigens that are the actual weapon. That's like a key thing. And this is the whole, these antigens are like these nasty toxic lipids, and they basically send your immune system into disarray. And it brings on this whole chronic immunosuppressed, like it's an immunosuppressive kind of thing. Your immune system just is, and it's something called immune tolerance. I go into it in my book in depth. And it sounds like a confusing term, but what it basically is your immune system is so suppressed that it's forced to tolerate harmful pathogens it otherwise should be keeping out of the body. And there was an entire cover-up about this whole condition, and this condition was discovered by Eric Traub. And so it was kind of like the backbone of his whole idea of stealth weapons, basically putting the immune system to sleep and bringing on these slow chronic diseases. Because, the whole idea was not to kill a bunch of people, because that draws a lot of attention. And then for that reason, things can be contained really quickly. But when you have something that just is stealth, and it's able to proliferate for a long time without much attention, and it's able to basically, a strategy called tire and exhaust, like you're trying to tire and exhaust the enemy. So overwhelm the public health system with these people who have these very complex chronic diseases. They don't know how to treat them. They're very resistant to treatment. And also the doctors are just kind of like, they don't know what to do with these patients. Then a lot of these people end up not being able to work anymore. So that puts a big strain on the economy. And another thing is, so with this whole immune tolerance condition, there's something I call the dark triad of immune tolerance, which is chronic disease, mental illness or neurological disorders, and cancers. Eric Traub found that he could raise the cancer rate to 50% with these kinds of things. So it's very, when you look at it, especially when you go through his work, it's harrowing, the effects that it can have. And so when he had these bioweapons that cause this immune tolerance, he noticed that it always came with this secondary effect on the brain and central nervous system. So you get people with these nasty neurological disorders and mental health problems. And it was like a nightmare. And that's basically what he put all of his time into. And a lot of these diseases were new diseases. They were animal diseases that were now human pathogens, and the doctors had never seen them before. So they didn't know what they were even dealing with when this all started. And so from the 50s onward, that's where things really start getting rolling in America with these nasty chronic diseases. And another thing I cover in the last chapter is some disturbing revelations on the polio vaccines and this guy MP Shumakov, this Soviet bioweaponeer that Albert Sabin teamed up with to make the oral polio vaccine that was given to millions of Americans. And he also worked closely with Jonas Salk. So, you got that, but it's, with that whole thing about the Lyme disease vaccine, like, I mean, that's one of the things I cover in depth too, is how there was this advisory committee where all of these vaccine victims were telling their stories, how they were permanently disabled and stuff. And I do remember that Joe Rogan thing because we were all really pissed off that Joe Rogan was giving this guy this opportunity and not really. I mean, I don't really remember. See, I don't remember what exactly happened, but as you said,
I actually found it. I found it. I found the clip where this is the one with Frankie Egger. This is when the first one I actually saw where he talks about it, and so I ran into this first.
yeah,
You can find the clip, JRE clips. Is Lyme disease a escaped bioweapon? Right. So they talk about this, and then in this clip they talk about the Lyme disease vaccine, and then I ran this clip.
yeah, this guy, I remember him. Yeah,
Yeah, Dr. Peter Hotez, which it ends up being the guy that he ends up debating, or
yeah,
offering to put together a debate with him on vaccines, and he refuses, even though they offered tons of money to do so. And then it was quite obvious that Rogan was being skeptical of his explanation to why the Lyme disease vaccine was pulled. And yeah, it was fascinating because it's like, okay, maybe this whole scenario, knowing that from the other clip that, that he had a personal experience and he knew, and so did actually Frank Yeager, the MMA legend, the UFC legend, Frank Yeager. He talks about, I think it was his wife who had Lyme disease, and that's actually what sparked the conversation. And and then you have the other the other clip, it was I'm curious looking back because Rogan seems like a pretty like open-minded guy.
yeah,
I think he gets stuff wrong sometimes, but I think he gets stuff wrong not because he's a shill or because he's a paid agent. I just think sometimes it's just where his logic and information that he's been exposed to took him. And then
yeah,
in time, maybe it takes him a little longer than the rest of us, but in time, he does come along eventually. And he did. I mean, with the vaccines, the fact that he had Robert Kennedy Jr. on, he literally gave him, multiple hours to spew and go through the whole history of vaccine science and how we got to where we are today and why we have so much faith in vaccines. But yet we should have such little faith in vaccines, according to the lack of studies and science behind it. I think was awesome. And I honestly remember the day that I had Del Bigtree. Del Bigtree's been on quite a few times, but I remember one time he was on, and I asked him like, "Hey, you got a lot of friends in high places. You're friends with Robert Kennedy Jr., who also has a lot of friends in high places. I'm like, how about you guys go on the Rogan podcast and like share some of this information because it'd be a great platform to really open minds to the lack of science in vaccine science." And this was like right at the end of one of his appearances on my show, and he's like, Joe Rogan's I forget what he used. If he said he's a wuss or he's a coward or something, and he's like, we've been trying to get on that show forever, and he won't have us on, but he'll have Dr. Hotez on, and he'll have and
yeah, we were mad when he did that. And the lady who taught me the immunology before I started looking into Traub, she testified at the FDA hearing against that vaccine. So there was a big FDA hearing. All of these people who were injured were presenting their stories at that hearing. She testified. She used to work for Pfizer as a chem analyst, and she was talking about how this antigen causes the immune system to go haywire. And after she testified to the FDA, they threw her in jail on a trumped up charge. One of the guys who goes around harassing Lyme victims, Edward McSquegan, and I talk about that in the third to last chapter where I'm talking about the Lymerix vaccine. And yeah, they pulled the vaccine because it was causing serious problems. And there was a New York Times article about the reaction to Lyme shots and how people were having these injuries. And my mother my mother had it. She had problems from it. She said a lot of the people at work had problems from it, couldn't work after that. We met tons of people. And basically what I've also discovered here, in the larger picture of vaccines is that Eric Traub's immune tolerance is exactly what the vaccines are doing. They're burning out the immune system. That's basically what's going on here. So you will have the same disease as chronic Lyme disease. It's basically a burned out immune system, and then all of these viruses that are dormant, like Epstein-Barr virus and such, those reactivate and basically are just destroying your body from head to toe and a lot of those nasty chronic diseases. So what I discovered was that, yeah, you know, what these things are doing is they're burning out the immune system. People think that that their immune system can just handle endless inoculations, and that is not true. So,
in your opinion, what was like going back and looking at what sparked all this interest in these bioweapons? Like, was it to eventually use it against other countries? Was it for depopulation agendas? Like, well, what do you think was the reason why they were investing time and effort and resources in this type of studies?
So, what I have here is that a lot of this was Soviet bioterrorism, but of course, America's also, guilty as well. But basically, like this whole, like the whole globalism agenda. What I've got is that this same group that was, like a bunch of communists from the Soviet Union kind of have been infiltrating America for a very long time. Like this story starts back in World War I. And I talk about how I kind of loosely cover how this communist agenda was going on, how they were infiltrating the American system, and the whole idea was to sabotage it, take control of it and turn it upside down and then attack the people. But this same group seems to have become part of that whole globalist agenda. Like right now, we have who's running vaccine safety and review at the FDA, a guy named Konstantin Chumakov. It's MP Chumakov's son. MP Chumakov, he was involved in serious bioweapons for Stalin. He was like Stalin's top bioweaponeer. Killed off, several million Muslims and Mongolians in the Siberian regions, testing bioweapons starting in 1937. This guy was he was a serious guy. He was a hardcore bioweaponeer. And now his son is running vaccine safety and review at the FDA. So it's kind of eye-opening, and that's kind of like where I leave it off in the last chapter, is showing and this guy Konstantin is saying how, oh yeah, all of our, he says, the best testimony that everybody is here now doing extremely well. Practically all our graduates are now very highly successful American scientists. Some of them are department heads, lab chiefs, full professors, and it all came. Everybody who came from this department are doing extremely well. And he's talking about all of their guys from the Moscow University, where they kind of groom people into being bioweaponeers and such. Stuff like that. And the lady who was interviewing, she's like, oh, what about, I hope that the people who stayed in Russia are doing well, or is that your yardstick, is that they're here in the US? She's like, yeah, because in Russia, there's nobody who stayed. I know a couple guys who stayed there, but everybody else left. He's basically saying they came here and now fill spots and they now fill prominent positions in public health. So there was also another interesting book by a guy named R. Swinburne Clymer called The Age of Treason, and he was talking about this communist agenda to take control of the public health system and start poisoning us in various ways. So there's that whole thing that kind of bleeds into it. And I have so much material. I'm probably going to write many more books, but this book was, I think, this book was of such immense importance. It just, in the whole picture, this whole chronic disease thing, but also as it relates to vaccines. And it's just, it's crazy. Eye-opening, definitely.
When
But
COVID happened, obviously you were into this topic and doing this research prior to COVID. Once it did happen, did you immediately think it was something related to biowarfare, biological, weapon or something like that?
with the whole SARS coronavirus too.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, see, I have a little different of an opinion on where it came from, but I definitely think it was a biological weapon. Um, when I was looking into it, there was an explosion at this Siberian lab. So it was a Russian bioweapons lab called Vector. And now I talk about Vector, throughout this book. And so the reason why Russia took the lead into biological weapons is because they acquired Eric Traub's German lab. They took that whole thing, and then they acquired that Unit 731 from Japan. So they were able to, and they basically focused all of their time into biological warfare. The Americans were really dumb. They were always downplaying it. They're saying, "Oh, we don't think it could work," even though they started their program. The Soviet Union had a major lead and had a major advantage where they had all these German labs. They took all of Eric Traub's most important work, and he was probably the best bioweaponeer on Earth. And so they were definitely focused on these slow chronic diseases, the diseases that could cause these slow chronic diseases. And so this lab Vector, they were working on putting the HIV antigens into these common cold viruses. And so in September of 2019, I think it was, there was this big explosion at that lab. And there was all these articles saying, big explosion in lab housing smallpox and all these other, very contagious viruses, including coronaviruses, because they were doing research on that. And I have this Western biodefense paper. It was called something like Tailored Intelligence. They were keeping an eye on this explosion. And then there was a paper where they're saying, hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Right? So they're like, we might have a full-scale pandemic on our hands. And what it said in that paper was that SARS was spreading in Russia. That's what it says in the paper, right? And they say, all of a sudden there's a case of pneumonia in China. And so the Wuhan lab people go over to this hospital and take samples from this case. They bring it back to Wuhan, and then all of them get sick. That's what the paper was saying anyway. And so I don't know. I mean, they were working on coronaviruses too, but just the whole, I may put some articles together on this because a lot of people have been asking me, and this is kind of a big deal when they're looking at this and saying, hey, we might have a pandemic on our hands, and then all of a sudden there's a pandemic on our hands. You know what I mean? But it was so it traveled worldwide or whatever. I know there's a lot of people that just denied it, but I still think viruses exist, and I don't buy into the whole denial of germ theory, because this is something that I've looked heavily into, and I have deconstructed all of those arguments. And this is something that was every country was most concerned about this. This was something that was of such importance, and this is something that is the most classified. So basically, in the Cold War, everybody thinks it was about nuclear warfare. It was actually more about biological warfare. It's just that most of it was classified, basically. That's, according to John Loftus and what my research shows, that that looks to be true. Because the reason people like biological warfare is because you can get away with saying, oh, hey, it was an act of nature. It was an act of nature. And so these countries could attack you, right? But then they could just blame it on nature. You can't do that with nuclear warfare. You can't do that with chemical warfare. Even though they get down with that chemical warfare, and a lot of the chemical warfare has to do with getting their guys in our public health system to put these nasty chemicals on the market, for certain things. Like you hear of those antacids all the time causing cancer and such, stuff like that. That would be like a more viable form of chemical warfare. But biological warfare is something that became like the go-to for each country. So and what my book shows is it's been a constant war between superpowers back and forth. And since World War I. And actually I have George Washington, the first American president, quoted on the use of biological weapons against America with smallpox from the British. So this book is just it's so jam-packed with information. And I have a website for it, and I have a YouTube channel as well to kind of clarify all that stuff. Like I like to make videos to clarify on certain aspects, to really like get into it deeper. So I have that, and my website is thesleeperagent.com. The book, you can get it on Amazon, but I also sell it at my site. I may stop doing that, but on that site, there's a section called videos, and that'll take you to my YouTube channel. And I'm also going to probably list my Rumble channel too, because they actually removed my video on MP Chumikov a few days ago. So, it's crazy. I get videos taken down so much. Yeah, that's the site. I made that site. There's like that section called videos up there on the thing. Videos all the way to the right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's where you can find my YouTube channel, and I'm gonna update that and put my Rumble channel in my Odyssey channel. So, and of course, you could go to store, and there's my book. But I would say people could probably get it on Amazon because they offer free shipping. I can't do that.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. And I actually made that cover too.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Now, in regards to like while doing this research, I know you briefly mentioned a lot of mystery diseases and other stuff like that. Like, what other diseases do you think the average public might not be aware could be related to biowarfare or some biological experiment or whatnot? Because there are a lot of diseases and medical unknowns out there, and like you said, probably some or many of them could be related to some of these experiments in labs.
And I also think that a lot of these mystery diseases, see, the thing about immune tolerance or throwing the immune system into disarray is that you get a unique course of disease. So each person will have a disease that unravels in a unique manner so that no two are exactly the same. That's the whole thing. And you know how they have like, when they're trying to diagnose diseases, they're trying to make these syndromes, and you have to fit into these boxes of disease that they, and a lot of these mystery diseases are very confusing, and they don't fit into this box. They don't fit into that box. So, and I think this condition, immune tolerance, see, the thing is that you can get it from these bioweapons, but you can also get it from these vaccines, like the burden. And one other thing I talk about in regard to Eric Traub's work is that he had these viruses that could pass down generations. They could pass down generations and get nastier with each coming generation. So it was a diabolical kind of thing, but these great imitator antigens I talk about, they're also being used as vaccines, but they cause the very same disease because it's the same antigen. That's why you can get chronic Lyme disease from the vaccine, even though there's no spirochetes in it, because it's this antigen that is causing the disease. Like these spirochetes are shedding these nasty antigens into your bloodstream, right? So that antigen that it's shedding is kind of like the weapon, more so than the actual spirochete. And when these things throw your immune system into disarray, you get all of these additional infections, and that's why they often call it the great imitator, because you get a whole bunch of other diseases. And that's the thing, is that I show that. So they covered up Eric Traub's immune tolerance as it related to infectious disease. They gave two guys the Nobel Prize about it as it related to organ transplants, because organ transplant recipients get that same outcome for some reason, and it's probably something infectious involved. But they made it about that, and then they completely just were silent about the infectious origins of it and all of Traub's work. So I get like really into that, because what I show is that if they acknowledged Eric Traub's immune tolerance science as it relating to infectious disease, it basically explains the entire spectrum of chronic disease. It shows how it works. It shows how there's very little antibodies made. It shows how, because what you have is you have two sides of disease. You have acute disease, which is measured by like a heavy immune response, but then on the complete opposite spectrum, you have chronic disease, which is measured by immunosuppression. So a defective immune system rather than a heavy response.
What's your opinion on HIV?
That's something I also go into. In the last chapter, I have it related to a horse virus rather than a monkey virus. And it was this virus that Eric Traub was working on at Insel Range called equine infectious anemia virus. And so that guy, Luc Monaher, or whatever his name is, he was the French HIV researcher. Well, he found in some of these early AIDS cases, he published a paper called "A New Type of Retrovirus Isolated from Patients Presenting with Lymphadenopathy and Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome." And it says structural and antigenic relatedness with equine infectious anemia virus. So this virus is very closely related to it. It's a lentivirus. It's also a retrovirus. It affects the T cells like HIV. It uses reverse transcriptase. And basically what I found was that when they were making those monkey kidney tissues for the polio vaccines, they were mixing horse serum with it. And that's how, because there's all this talk about, oh, we can't link it to any of these monkey retroviruses. There's not really a solid link. But what I show is a pretty reliable link to this horse virus. And so they were adding horse serum, and that was a big deal. Over in Germany, the Soviet Union was doing all this testing with this virus, and they found how much of a problem it could cause in these vaccine factories. So horses were also made to produce serum and vaccines over there. And they found that when this virus contaminated those factories and those horses, it just caused havoc. And they realized that it could be spread by reused needles, just like HIV. And I have a pretty convincing, I think I have a pretty convincing section that shows that, yeah, this may actually be a horse virus. So that's kind of like where I stand on that.
Ever listen to the episode? I actually just found it with Peter Duesberg, the Rogan episode.
Yeah, I've never seen this.
Yeah, I highly recommend you checking it out. This is an old one.
Okay.
I've been listening to Rogan since like the beginning, so I know some of his old gems that people forget about. But this is
282.
yeah, 282, and what it is, and it's funny because he has Brian Callen on to because he's concerned that Peter Duesberg, right, was a very respected guy. He was
Yeah.
actually also friends with Dr. Mullins, who created the PCR test. So when you go back and listen to that episode, now everybody knows who Kerry Mullins is. But when he referred to him in that episode, the average person didn't know who that was. And also they refer to somebody else in that episode, Anthony Fauci, who was also not a household name at the time.
Yeah.
Now is a household name. But the reason why he had Dr. Peter Duesberg on is Dr. Peter Duesberg was a guy who argued what HIV was, and if it was actually killing people, or if the medications were killing people. And apparently he was a very respected person and scientist and doctor. And then once he came out with this theory on HIV, and wrote, I think it was a Rolling Stones article he published in, all of a sudden he gets all this pushback. He goes into how Anthony Fauci tries to demonize him and all this
Oh, yeah.
stuff. And
He was an early AIDS researcher, Fauci.
yep.
Yep.
And then goes into all that. And it's a very interesting show, because at the time nobody took it seriously, but now as people open their eyes and open their minds to experts and a lot of the information that we just kind of accept as truth, even though many of us haven't done any research on it, we just accept that if the experts are saying it, it must be true. Somebody must have looked into it. One thing you'll find, and which I'm sure you can agree with, is like a lot of times when there's a accepted mainstream theory, when you go history and you look at the history, the origin of it, you'll find that there's always people who contradict that theory, who think that theory is incorrect. And those voices in many cases are suppressed. And in this case, he was one of them. He's very, very few people know who he is. Very few people know about this podcast, but it was very intriguing, and it's a different perspective on HIV and AIDS, and if the disease was, actually from the virus, and if the virus itself was killing people, or if it was the medications.
I think it was a complex picture. Like there were many things, and of course those medications are very problematic. Like, and then you have also with that kind of condition, the AIDS, you have so many other infections that are adding into this. So you usually, you get these reactivated Epstein-Barr viruses and all of those human herpes viruses that are common that reactivate. And those are neurotropic when they reactivate, a lot of them. Like they start destroying your brain and central nervous system. But then you get I know a lot of early AIDS patients had other things. Like some of them had STDs that were really nasty. And I also remember, actually, since there was this fungus parasite that Eric Traub used to look into. It was called, what was it called? Encephalitozoan caniculi. It was this rabbit fungus, right? And I started to find that a lot of these AIDS cases had these opportunistic infections with things like that, and all sorts of these, rare diseases that don't normally infect humans, but then when you have that condition, you get all these additional infections. And then, when you start adding these dubious medications, then of course, there's a lot bleeding into that, I think. I've kind of felt that there was a virus, and it was causing this immunosuppression from these antigens. And my official position is this horse virus. That's what I'm going with. But of course, I'm sure there are a bunch of points that some of these other guys, like you were saying, that they bring up that are definitely valid.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, it's definitely worth listening to, and it's worth
Mhm.
kind of
But
hearing.
I've always found too, like when you really want to know something about, the truth about something, it's kind of like you really got to look into it yourself. And this whole area was something I was so deep into, and getting these rare German papers that brought all this stuff that no one would have known about. And of course, it was in the German language. Um, there were all sorts of diseases that they produced, and serious bioweapons from these animal diseases. A lot of times, viruses, because Eric Traub was mainly a virus researcher, but he was very skilled in bacteriology as well. And basically, what he did was he weaponized these spirochetes with these viral proteins, is what I have. And but that horse virus was something that they were working on like heavily at that time. I just kind of, I don't know. I mean, I included it in here at the last chapter, because it had to do with the polio vaccines, because I think that's where they came from. But my position is that it was that horse serum that they added to it to produce these monkey kidney cultures that they grew the virus in. They added horse serum into it, and a lot of times that horse virus was very stealth, and it was very hard to diagnose. And I remember the guy from Germany was saying that in the vaccine factories, it was such a problem that if they really wanted to deal with it effectively, they had to shut down the whole operation and have this long, drawn out diagnosing procedure that took months, if not, years. And it was like, it was such a problem that a lot of the manufacturers decided, well, we don't agree with your diagnosis of this equine infectious anemia virus. We don't think there's any such thing actually. And so eventually things got so bad that they learned from bitter experience, and they had to shut down their factories. And so that's where I show that, these guys realized how much havoc it could wreak when it comes to vaccines. And I do talk about a vaccine sabotage program in this whole thing. So even though, a vaccine by itself can cause serious problems, and usually does, and I personally wouldn't get any of them, but they also have these things. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about the SV40 thing. Remember with the polio vaccine? So this was like a oncogenic virus that contaminated, and it was given to half of the U.S. population. 1960, they said something like 200 million people got this contaminated vaccine. And it contaminated the Salk vaccine, and it contaminated the Sabin and Chumikov vaccine. And then I have a document, this vaccine advisory committee, where they're taking a look at it, and they do admit in that it was a transforming virus, meaning it was carcinogenic. But of course, they won't say that like on record, like publicly. They don't want to say that because they know it comes along with that. If they say, yeah, it's carcinogenic, then they have to take accountability for the fact that they gave it to half the U.S. population, which is crazy,
Without a doubt. Another, I know we briefly talked about AIDS. Another movie that came to mind was Dallas Buyers Club, because that was kind of about the medications that were killing people.
What was it called?
The Dallas Buyers Club. You never watched it? Oh
No.
it's right here.
Huh.
Yeah.
Kind of like Philadelphia in a way, right?
What it was this guy who had AIDS who found out that these alternative treatments, they couldn't be sold in America. They had to get them in the black market from Mexico, and they were the treatments they were giving to people in America were killing people. So
yeah,
it's about kind of that story. And I've never looked into it, but I've heard multiple people say that film was inspired by Anthony Fauci, because obviously he was the one pushing the AZT drugs and whatnot. So if somebody wants to watch a good film about a true story inspired by true stories and true events, definitely check out the Dallas Buyers Club. I definitely need to have you back on again. I got to go pick up the
Yeah,
kids.
anytime.
I know you said you're a metalhead. I'm sure you probably know I'm obviously I
Yeah,
look.
I see all those guitars. Yeah, I'm a drummer actually. I grew up playing in like drumming in hardcore bands and such.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. I've had a few metalheads on the show. I've had Mike Martins, who's actually from my town, Ludlow. He's the guitarist of All That Remains, and
Oh
I've
yeah,
Fear Factory on. I've had Fire from the Gods. I've had quite a Miss May I singer.
you remember that band Overcast?
That sounds super familiar.
It was Brian Fair, the singer of Shadows Fall.
Yeah, Shadows Fall was local because I'm from
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
from
they had a band called Overcast, and actually, it was the bassist of Killswitch Engage. Um, and Brian Fair was on vocals. That band was amazing. I used to go see them all the time.
Flatlined. There's a band Flatline that was a heavy band from around here. Under Earth. Some people are big Unearth fans. That
Yeah,
they're good back in the day.
I had a show. We had a show. When I was in a band called A Step Apart, we had a show booked with them, but we didn't get to it. I think we broke up before that.
Yeah, it's hard to keep a band together.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard keeping bands together. But yeah, I am such a metalhead that I love to include metal in all of my videos. Like I'll have a metal song going, for a minute in the intro, and then at the end of the video, I'll play a metal song. Lately, I've been on an Avenged Sevenfold kick, but I like there's so many metal bands that I just love, and that's one of the therapies for me is just I get on my BMX bike. I got a mongoose over here. I get on my bike and I get my headphones going and I just crank that metal and just get all of it out of my system on that bike every day.
Yeah, no, I grew up a skater myself, BMXing and skateboarding. And I remember when I had Scott Horton on the show the first time. The whole end of the episode, we just talked about skateboarding because he was a big skater too. So
Yeah, I was a skateboarder as well. I actually got into BMX. This is kind of a recent thing. I was a skateboarder back in the day, but lately I got into BMXing and I go to the skate park like 10 minutes from here.
that's awesome.
Great time.
Yeah, we need more skate parks because I remember getting kicked out of every public property that we
Yeah.
were out at. I'm sure you have similar experiences, but yeah, it's give kids somewhere to hang out where they can hang out. If you don't give them something to do, they're just going to cause trouble. So it's like
You know what I noticed is like these nasty diseases that were proliferating in the United States. They were what is called neurotropic. They attacked the central nervous system and basically like made people more angry and stuff. So the whole rise of heavy metal makes complete sense,
That's
In
funny.
that sense.
Yeah, that's something we'll have to discuss next time and kind of expand on that theory. And so for listeners who are, and I'll have to have you also on a future Union Unwanted.
Anytime, my friend.
And we'll definitely have you on and I'm sure after appearing on this show I'll probably get some people contacting me about like, hey, can you hook me up with some contact info? So
Yeah, they can go to my website. I think there's a email address under the author or contact. There might be a contact page. I can't remember, but basically my YouTube channel is listed there and the sleeperagent.com. I think there's an email address where people can get a hold of me. I think it's just info@thesleeperagent.com.
yeah, I just found it. That's it. Yeah. So
I'm up for interviews, with whoever wants to do it because I'm trying to get the message out, and it's hard trying to battle all the censorship and whatever.
yeah. So if for people listening who want to keep up with your work, your websites, I'm assuming the best spot. I'm going to put links to your website. I'll put links to your YouTube channel, your Rumble channel, any links you have out there that you want me to include in the show description. Email me, send it to me so that way I can make sure I include them. Your book. Do you prefer Amazon or your website?
Yeah, I think I'm going to stop selling it on my site because I kind of want to keep those books to kind of give to people, kind of like I did for you.
Yeah.
Kind of use as promo. And plus, if you get it on Amazon, most people have that Prime and you get free shipping. So
Yeah.
you can't really beat that, you know?
It's hard. It's hard to fight it back against the machine when the machine is so damn convenient.
And yeah, I'll come on anytime you want to talk. I have so much information on this biological warfare stuff. This has been my area for many years now.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Adam, for doing this crazy amount of research and diving deep into this topic. I definitely think it's a topic that there's not enough researchers really going into, which I think that, you know, having your book with so much information is definitely a useful tool to understand how important this is and just really the history of it all. And then also I'll send you links to the show once it's up and live. Obviously feel free to post it, share it anywhere you want. All my work is open source. So I always tell listeners, share
Thank
it.
you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I was always saying to myself, oh, I got to get back to Ricky. That was actually 2021 when we talked last. And I was like, yeah, you know, maybe I was thinking to myself, I'll wait till my book's out, then I'll contact him.
Yeah, well, it was perfect time when you hit me up and then you had the book out. I'm like, oh, this is perfect because now
Yeah.
we can promote it and we can let people know about it. And I love the fact that it's available on Amazon because, like I said, people I think sometimes are more likely to purchase something when it's convenient.
Yeah, my publisher Trine Day, they've published a lot of good books. But yeah, it's available now. This took so long to get into a final product. And when I got this, I opened the box. There's actually a video of it. I was just like, man, wow. I can't believe it's finally done.
You said in the beginning of the show that you're just an average guy. You
Yeah.
are officially not an average guy. You are now a author.
Yeah.
Now we can refer to you as an author, which is
Well, I had a very troublesome upbringing, like just, you know, troublemaking and just getting into the whole drugs thing. And I completely got out of that. Luckily, a lot of my friends are dead. But
well,
you know, and I'm like, man, I got to put my time into something good and actually start achieving.
that's awesome. Yeah, and the other thing too is like when you put out art, when you put out some type of work like this, it outlasts our flesh and blood and our, you know, our physical bodies. It's a legacy we can leave behind, and it's something that matters and it's fulfilling. We feel like we're giving something back to the universe and we're doing something with purpose and meaning. So without a doubt, we'll definitely talk again for sure in the near future. And I'll if there's, like I said, if there's any links, any bio or anything, any headshots, anything that you want me to specifically use, feel free to email it to me and I'll make sure to include it. And then I'll send you the show once it's up and live. Hopefully it'll be up within the next couple days before the weekend, and then share it anywhere and everywhere. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for the time, and thanks for being flexible because I know we moved around a little bit, and flexible. And I'm sure we'll talk again in the near future.
Awesome.
Thanks, Adam. Take care.
All right, my friend.
Take care.
Yeah.